So last week I released a guide on the weakness synergy, and I went into all the detail I could into all the interactions within it, and I slightly touched on lineup recommendations, but I felt like a series of tier lists going into more specifics on this would probably be a good idea now of the current state of the game, with pretty much all the commanders being awakened at this point. So this is about where we're going to be at forevermore. So as an initial starting point, there will obviously have to be Jaime at the top as S tier. This synergy does not work without Jaime. He is the entire core of it through his 4-star ability. He is the namesake of the build after all. And on the same note as that, Drake, Enzo and Latz will also have to be S tier, because without them, he just doesn't have the healing sources to actually function to the level he realistically needs to function at. So those 4 will be a pretty staple S tier. And realistically, although I might put other stuff in there, these are in a tier of their own in a sense, because these 4 by themselves is the entire synergy. You can supplement it here and there and exaggerate it through adding stats and effects that work off of it, but this is how you're going to get the weakness attacks churning out, and that's going to be the engine of the build. On the same note as that, Sonara is bottom tier. She excites all troops, which blocks weakness attacks, so she doesn't work at all. And through that, basically anything that synergizes with her will also be bottom tier. Barrett, his 4-star ability only procs off normal attacks. Anything that procs off normal attacks won't work with Jaime, basically, because weakness attacks do not count as normal attacks. So Barrett is bottom tier. Rhea will be bottom tier for the same reason. Daeron will be bottom tier for the same reason. Meryl will be bottom tier for the same reason. Kevin also will be bottom tier for the same reason. And that might raise eyebrows, because on his release and for a long while afterwards, he was actually bugged, and his 4-star ability did actually work off weakness attacks when it shouldn't have. You can see there he does have normal attack in his tooltip, and when you look at him in reports, this is a very screenshot Discord tab. Oh my god! So here I'm attacking a rebel group with Latz as the Jaime enabler and Kevin. So for the first 14 seconds, there will be no healing, so no weakness attacks. And in that first 14 seconds, you'll see that Kevin is stacking his buff up through the normal attacks, and it continues that way. You can see, you might have to squint to see it, but you'll see it keeps stacking. It just can't stack to huge levels without Sonara present, obviously. But when you get to this point where all lineups receive healing, this will be the last normal attack, and then past this point, when they start weakness attacking, you'll see this ghostly barrier effect has disappeared, and there'll be no further applications of it because the weakness attacks will not apply Kevin's buff whatsoever. So because of that, even though historically he was actually quite good at weakness builds, he would have been like up here or here maybe, Kevin is now effectively unusable in them. Sandor also has the tooltip where he only procs off normal attacks when the allied front row lands total of 40 normal attacks, so he doesn't work either. The female stuff is a bit easier to hybrid in with weakness, of course, because they can still use their active abilities, so they'll be a bit higher tier than the bleed stuff will be. John is the only other one who has a tooltip that goes off normal attacks, so you could realistically put him down here as well. He is, however, slightly different than the others in that his ability is front-loaded, so he only does stuff for the first 15 to 25 seconds of the fight. The damage reduction will have universal value regardless, of course, but the crits, weakness attacks can't crit, so this will be useless after Latz or Drake or Enzo or whatever starts healing. But in that first 14 seconds, assuming you don't have the healing enabler's weapon. You can crit in that time period. That time period will be slightly minimized by the movement of the first few seconds of the fight, depending on what you're fighting. Like, if you have to break through a wall in live PvP or something, that'll be really minimized. But you can potentially get a good 10 seconds of crits out there, which isn't of huge value because you're not going to be running rare. But when you consider the fact he's giving like 55% all total stats, it isn't horrendous. B is probably generous, to be fair, but the stats are really solid. That's the issue. I'll keep him in B for now, but whatever else I put in here will probably push him down, and he'll be a low B tier. I think a good baseline for this B tier will be the 30% stat funneler commanders, so Andrea, Meranda, and Laena. These are very basic. The thing, as I said earlier, is the bulk of the synergy will just be the healing enabler or enablers plus Jaime. So if you're running, say, like mono inf weakness and you just have Latz Jaime, you're just going to want to funnel imp stats into that. So something like Andrea with that will actually be very good and will have a very real place in weakness builds through that. So you can't put them too low tier as a result, because they will for sure have good value. I think below this top tier is a good place to put Hector. So Hector has better stats than these guys down here, but he has worse healing than these guys down here, so he's sort of caught in between. The issue with Hector is his healing is just a one-time effect. He'll heal the first actives cast onto you, but he won't repeat that casting like Latz, Enzo, and Drake do. That's why these are all so good, because of how they repeat their heal just over and over and over again, and they heal quicker than the weakness state actually ends, so you can retain 100% weakness attack uptime. Hector, you're basically going to want to heal before these guys start healing to increase your weakness attack uptime, and to do that you're going to either need to not have these guys' weapons, not be into bleed, or be into Salma, which is a fair bit too conditional for me to put him in S tier, honestly. And the fact that bleed is, as weakness, your main counter, and Hector is literally useless against bleed because they can't cast actives to actually proc his 4-star ability at all, really makes him a bit awkward, in my opinion. Against female builds, he's great, obviously. Against weakness mirrors, he's good if you're mono spear or something. But I do think he's slightly overrated to the average player, in my opinion. Patelo will be up there with him, though. He has healing synergy, the damage reduction, and the attack on his 4-star, when you account for uptime, is actually really solid. Especially the flat damage reduction. If you envision that as a health percentage, it will easily surpass, say, 100% health if you're a top account, which is fairly crazy to imagine. And it is for sure hard to visualize what it actually does. I've gone over the maths of this multiple times, and in previous videos I did a whole video dedicated to Patelo if you want to know more specifics about this. But for triple weakness setups, he's a very, very good 5th with how he buffs multiple attacks and whatnot. This 5 at the top is a very, very good mid-spender build generally. And of course Patelo will find his way into many variations of weakness builds if you're running mono imp or imp spear, mono spear, whatever. He's very, very good. I think Arslan is, you could potentially argue he should be an A with these. I'll put him at the top of B tier. Realistically, the issue Arslan has is his heal only hits one lineup, as opposed to all 5 lineups from Hector and Latz, Enzo, Drake. So his weakness attack damage is basically irrelevant in comparison, especially because it's only going to hit once before any of these are guaranteed to go off for the rest of the fight. in this top 3 commander's case. So he's mostly going to be a stat funneler realistically, but he does serve that function very well. Weakness has a spear bias with Jaime, with Hector, with Arslan, and he does fit that role pretty well. If you're running like Jaime, Drake, Patelo, Arslan, Hector, or Jaime, Drake, Patelo, Arslan, Gorell, or something like that, you can make very decent mono spear builds for quite a low investment with different variations like that. Things like Annie and Arya are probably C tier. They're not useless like this bottom tier, but they don't have the synergy necessarily present to really exaggerate their strengths, and you really want to funnel high attack stats through the weakness damage multipliers, and they don't necessarily help that to any large degree, so I don't think you can put them in too high a tier. I think probably Margaery serves a similar function in female builds, so she can probably go in the same tier as them. You do then have the female enablers here. I think Salma is very much a B tier commander because she has a very solid place in things like spear cav weakness like that with a 5, where her passive stats are just so good that she can find her way into builds that are very commonly used here. Leila is a bit trickier because you can run female weakness builds, but whenever I get in these situations, that my inclination is always to just cut the female element out of it. Like, you could run, say, a female weakness hybrid of like spear cav or something and run something like this, but there just isn't really enough value in this female trio that would overcome running like double weakness as something like this and then having like Arslan or Hector or Patelo or something in there instead over Annie. Salma serves a purpose for the stats, but I don't know, I think in most scenarios you'll find it's just better to run full weakness if you're committing to weakness builds to this extent. There are probably certain variations where Leila gains value though. I just think at the mid-spender bracket, going all in on weakness will outscale female in any way. Female really needs Cersei to be thrown in there to catch up to weakness at this point. And if you're investing into Cersei, you're probably just running female rather than weakness. If you do have Cersei though, she is probably an A tier. Weakness doesn't silence active abilities, so they will cast 4 per commander per fight. So you will just get a lot of extra damage through wildfire because of that. But you won't exaggerate what she does to the extent of a full female build with Leila will do. So you can't put her up in S tier like you would with a female build. There are a fair few of the 1000 BD commanders here that are quite difficult to rank, I think. So Daenerys, again, you could probably argue as S tier, but I'll keep her at the very, very top of A tier for now instead. She's a very common first buy for these premium commanders because she has such universal value. With her dragon attack, with the reduced active cooldown, the disarm, she can pretty much slot into any build. Even with bleed builds, she'll get silenced, but her dragon attack does so much damage that whilst it's rarely optimal unless you're hitting into weak multi-lined castles and you're direct rallying or solo attacking someone you should be smashing anyway, it's normally suboptimal, but it's okay. You can have that dragon attack hit for like over 1 million fairly easily. And then Baelish as well is in this sort of bracket as well. The issue of Baelish is that if you're facing female, he's like S tier. He's absurd if you're against female. But your counter in the synergy world is bleed. Because of Kevin against female, you bypass their disarm effects on Cersei and Daenerys anyway, so you're already countering female. And Baelish is just sort of a win more mechanic against female. He's good against weakness as well in mirrors. But the fact he does nothing against bleed, which is your counter, is just a very awkward mechanic. So it's like if you're against bleed, he's here. If you're against female, he's off the screen up here. So it's awkward to place on a tier list. I'll put him in A tier, and if someone has skipped to the end of the video and looked at what I've done the tier list as and not listened to anything I've said, there may be 1 or 2 angry comments calling me an idiot for this. But it's just the fact he does nothing against bleed. Because Sanara obviously silences all the commanders on the enemy side herself. So Baelish can't reverse any of the actives. And all he's going to be bringing is 56% total stats, which is decent. But his whole functionality is just totally blocked. But yeah, as I said, if you're against weakness mirrors, or especially female, he will be up in S tier for sure. Chris, Gorell, just very basic stat givers. I think Seg would be here as well. There's just no real reason to use them above this other stuff. If you have them, I think Julien as well, probably just very basic. He can be a decent 5th in a triple weakness setups, like on castle defending, potentially, because of the attack stats he gives. But I think he's been a bit power crept by something like Patelo in that role now, to be honest. But he does potentially have somewhat of a purpose there. I think Winton is also terrible. Perhaps I'm just not giving him the credit he deserves, but this will block like 1 active cast, and his stats are just so middling. There are so many better options. If you're running Cav, weakness is going to be the worst synergy type anyway, except hybriding in like Enzo Jaime into a female build. So he just doesn't have a place at all compared to the other stuff. I think Haley, probably bottom tier. You could probably argue she's here. She doesn't have anti-synergy like any of this stuff necessarily has, but she'd also just be worse than Sandor is because of the stats. So, well, actually, she probably wouldn't be, actually, because the issue with Sandor is he will silence 2 commanders whilst his ability effectively won't work. So, I guess Sandor definitely does belong down there. But I don't know. When are you ever going to find yourself running Haley in a weakness build? There's just such better options. If you want a stat funneler for mono-inf weakness, something like Chris will be better regardless. Senelle, again, it's sort of what I said of Winton as well. Like, if you have Senelle, you want to run Cav, and there's just no reason you'd run a weakness build over a full female build if you have Senelle. You should be running Leila, you should be running Salma, you should be running Senelle. And then you're at that budget if you have Senelle where you're gonna have Dany Cersei. So it's just awkward. She relies on active snowballing, which is sort of hard to incorporate in weakness builds, because even if you hybrid in elements of female, you're not gonna have the 5 females being multi-procced off Leila, being cast at 1 second off Salma. So realistically, she's probably like a B tier. If you're running weakness Cav, her stats alone will be ridiculous. I want to put her down just because that you shouldn't be running her with weakness builds, but I'll leave her there. And then it's Night King and Daena. I've and ahed over these 2 quite a bit, honestly. I'm also very uncomfortable looking at this and seeing Patelo, Hector, and Cersei in the same tier as Dany and Baelish, because they do not belong in the same tier as those 2. Perhaps I should move these 2 up because of that. But then I also sort of want to put these 2 up there. And then it's sort of like, what am I doing? If I do that, it just looks so imbalanced. But on the same note, it's probably accurate, so I'm not entirely sure what to do about that. Daena, when you actually look at her in reports, she lists as reducing damage by 60%, even though her tooltip says 60%. But when you actually do the maths on it, she does reduce damage by 60%, and it is just a tooltip error in reports. This shield effect too, it seems to absorb 1 instance of damage on the lineup, but it can't be bleeds or dragon damage. If you look here, Daena's shield is applied, and then the dragon does damage to 4 lineups, and then those lineups are attacked on the same second, and if you take note of these numbers, it's about 1,000 per hit, and then the next second before Daena's shield can be reapplied, those lineups are hit again for about 2,600 damage. And I did the maths back up here. That is like approximately 40% damage taken on the 1,000 damage taken. So that means that dragon damage bypasses the shield effect, which is something to be aware of. Daena is of course very, very good for mono spear weakness builds. She is quite specific to that though, because our stats are so all in on spears, of course. All this other stuff has total stats and can flex to different unit types. And something to note with how this shield mechanic works as well is that it's all well and good in a scenario like this. Like here, the ally in green is a bleed composition. I think it might be female. I can't remember. Either way, it's not weakness. So it's attacking each lineup. You see here, like C5 is hitting A5, C4 is hitting A4, 2 is hitting 2, 3 is hitting 3. In weakness mirrors, in a situation like this C5 lineup would hit A5, take the shield off A5, but then C4 would hit A5 without the shield, C2 would hit A5 without the shield, C3 would hit A5 without the shield. So weakness sort of bypasses that shield mechanic to quite a large degree, because all these other shields on the other lineups are basically irrelevant because of how weakness works. So in weakness mirrors, I won't go as far as saying Daena's bad because of her stats, obviously, but she loses a lot of her value, and that shield mechanic is actually going to be fairly irrelevant, actually. And her anti-counter isn't going to be getting much value either, because you're probably not going to be facing an inf weakness build. She's at her best, realistically, when facing into bleed, and I think that's a good thing, because as I said with Baelish, bleed is your counter, and for me personally at least, I'd rather minimize that counter against me than exaggerate how hard I beat my own counter in female. The issue is though, Baelish will do better against weakness mirrors than Daena will do against weakness mirrors, so it can be quite tricky at this premium level deciding what commanders to pair with your weakness enablers. And it's honestly going to be very, very situational. So Daena will be best into bleed, Baelish will be best into female, Night King will be best when you realistically want to exploit the casualty rate increase in stuff like CCS and GB. And Dany will have the most guaranteed value of all of them, potentially, besides Night King. Although I think in something like AC, Dany might actually be better than Night King in terms of what she brings in those rallying scenarios where troop losses aren't real. I might be wrong about that, but her dragon attack alone, if it's hitting into multiple lines, will just do so much damage. If you're running like double weakness, you can mix and match this. You could run Jaime, Drake, Enzo, Dany, Baelish. You can run Jaime, Latz, Enzo, Night King, Dany, expecting to run into bleed or something like that. Because in that scenario, you have your maybe Cav or Imp on the front line to minimize bleed probably being Imp into you. That means you cut Daena, because you're not running spears. You don't run Baelish, because they don't have active castings. And you can sort of toy with it like that. At a mid-spender level, I do think the best 5 for triple weakness is this 5, because Patelo functions best into bleed. If you're running double weakness, you could do Patelo and Hector in there for spearfront stuff. You can do Patelo and Andrea in there for like Imp Cav double weakness. There are a lot of variations you can do with all these B and A tier commanders and just slot them upwards. Cersei will be good, but realistically, I wouldn't chase her if you're a weakness player. I'd only just throw her in there if you're like a female player and you happen to have her and are running weakness for whatever reason. And yeah, I think that's pretty much on the whole where everything stacks up with the weakness synergy.